This mimer is from 40 years ago, and as we said last week, the significance of something which is 40 years old, which gives it a special connection to anything that we have in our lives of understanding and study Torah, that when the Torah is already here for 40 years, then it gives us the we're able to understand it properly and in a certain extra measure. Okay. The mimer was 40 years ago, 5744, was at this part of the year, was exactly the same like it is this year, with Purim being on Sunday, and Shabbos, Zachor, was Erev Purim. That means that the mitzvah, fulfilling the mitzvah of remembering Amalek, was actually right before Purim on that Shabbos. That Shabbos, the Rebbe said the following mimer: Zachor asher Osah Lecha Amalek b'derech b'tzeischem miMitzrayim. We're commanded by God to remember that which Amalek, the nation of Amalek, did to you when you were on your way leaving Egypt. And subsequently, this is of course in the end of Deuteronomy, in Parshas Kitzeitze. Afterwards it says, Timcha zecher zecher Amalek. You shall obliterate the remembrance of Amalek. And the verse finishes, U'Mesayim, Loi sishkach, you shall not forget. The Rebbe is going to ask several questions to help us understand the precision of this commandment and what God tells us to do and what it's about in our day-to-day life, in our own life, as everything in Torah is. What is this whole idea of remembering Amalek, that we're commanded that we have to remember this? A lot of things happen to the Jewish people along the way, and we do study about it when we study the parsha, whatever it may be, but there's not a special commandment that we have to set aside a time to actually focus on it, remember it, and then do the next step, which means to wipe out this. Is it the memory or this idea? What is it about? So we're going to talk about this. We have to obliterate this. We can't forget it. So, the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, brings in his discourse of Zachor in the year of 5654, which would be 1894. And several, he brings this in several of his discourses in other years too, and other Rabbeim also bring it. Masha Kosov b'nevuas Bilam. There's the famous verse that when Bilam was hired by Balak to come along and to curse, heaven forbid, the Jewish nation. So we all know the story that when he finally started to speak, he brought about, and he said blessings. He blessed the people. So one of the verses there says, the head of nations, means the first and foremost nation is, of the nations is Amalek, and its end is total destruction, total obliteration. He has to be wiped out totally. Amalek, the nation of Amalek, was the only nation that we were commanded that they had to be wiped out completely and totally, and that's the mitzvah. דאף שיש גויים מכל מקום דווקא המולק שהוא לשיסו מכניסי עד העבד, וכמובן מהמפורש בנבואות בלעם שם, ששאר הגויים לא יעבדו לעשיד, אלא דווקא המולק. Indeed, in the subsequent prophecy of Bilam, it says clearly that all the nations of the world in the future to come will not be destroyed at all. Only Amalek. On the contrary, it says explicitly in this scripture, and this is the prophecy of Tzefania, and the Rebbe bring this in the Maimer too. The Rebbe used to quote this verse quite often. Ki Osah epechalam himself of brura likre kulam b'shem havaya lov d'shechem echad. At that time, the time of the coming of Mashiach, I will turn all of the people in one clear, in a clear calling, that they will all call out in the same tone, the same language, to call out in God's name in one unified flank, everyone together. Everyone will be the same. So everyone will be serving God. V'hainu, everyone will be elevated, all peoples, all nations will be, no matter what they were feeling or serving or doing, they'll be elevated to devotion to God, to belief in God. And that goes for everybody. Whatever may have been challenging before will be now, they'll be devoted to studying Torah and following and pursuing godliness and goodness and all kinds of things. So then, and Amalek is not joined into this, just everybody else. So then why is it that nations of all peoples, which is Amalek, they are not included? Their end has to be obliteration, total destruction. We also don't understand even further this verse itself, of the mere fact that he says he's the first of the peoples. That means that Amalek is connected to the other peoples, the other nations. So then now he's going to get a different type of treatment, that he has to be destroyed, and the others will be involved. So if he's connected to everybody, he should be part of everybody, that he should be able to also be, let's just say, elevated or involved or renewed in terms of doing the right thing. Oid maybe shom. The Rebbe continues to bring from the Rebbe Rashab. Masha Omru b'Medrash ala posuk zichrenechem nishleof efer. It says in the Medrash, commenting on the verse in Job, that your memories in your memory is like of ashes. Omar Kodesh Baruch Hu, the Medrash says, commenting, what does that mean? I have given you two things to remember. Now, of course, there are actually what we say, there are the 6 remembrances, and there are even other things that it says to remember. Well, pause for a moment. Okay, so there are two things that God said. The Medrash here is talking about these 2 things that we have to remember. There are other things in Torah that Torah says to remember, but there are 2 memories, two things to remember. Zachor Amalek. Remember what Amalek did to you. That's one. Timcha Zachor Amalek. That and to obliterate the memory, the remembrance of Amalek. Havu zehirim b'hem v'imasisim kach hareaton bonov shel Avraham shenim shel Lecha. And be careful with this, do this, remember this, and obliterate the memory, fulfill this request of mine, and if you do so, you are then demonstrating you are the children of the descendants of Abraham, Abraham Avinu, our father Abraham, Shanim Shalefer, who is compared to ashes, ash. If you remember that Abraham Avinu, when he was thankful to God in his humility, he says, and I am dust and ash. וצריך להבין מהו עניין זכירת עמלק, וזה שבני ישראל הם בנו של אברהם דווקא. What's this connection, this association of remembering Amalek with the fact that we are the descendants of Abraham, specifically? And now we have to get to the nitty-gritty, because the Torah is telling us that each and every passage of the Torah gives us a lesson in our life. The Torah is called Torah's Chaim, the Torah of life, which is a lesson in our life. And if the Torah gives us these specific instructions and says these things about Amalek, then there's something about what we have to do in our day-to-day life. Indeed, we're taught in the Talmud that there's a discussion, what is greater, Torah study or the performance of mitzvahs, the action, the deed of the mitzvah? Great discussion.
We're still recording, but the stream stopped working.
Okay. So there's a discussion. There's the greatness of the great part of the deed, actual performing a mitzvah, and then there's Torah study. And the Talmud resolves this by saying that learning is greater. Why is learning greater? Because it brings to action, it brings to the deed, which ironically illustrates the fact that the deed then must be very great. And in order to do the deed, you need to study. And why is study greater? Because it brings to the deed. It's also been pointed out that the mere action of Torah study is a deed. So you have both. But the Torah and mitzvahs go, of course, hand in hand, are together. So the idea that Torah study brings about the performance of mitzvahs, it also means the way we live our lives, our whole attitude towards living, our whole focus in life. So the lesson and the instruction in how to serve God comes from how we study Torah and what we learn in the Torah. And like as the Zohar actually tells us that even the stories in Torah are there to teach us a lesson and give us an instruction in how we should live our lives. Which this implies too that there's more than one type of war that is discussed in Torah, actually two basic ones, and therefore in our odyssey in our own lives, in our own little personal little war over the evil inclination that tells us to do what we shouldn't do and tells us don't do what you should do and gets us involved. So in this war, we also have maybe two ways to wage the war, and like the Rebbe is going to speak about this. So Bezer Fani Milchama Mitzuporim B'Torah Mishum Sheyesh Bezer Fani Meilu Gam B'Avedas Ha'Adam. V'hinei Bezer Fani Milchama Eila B'Chlolos Hei Milchemes Kibush Eretz Zayin Umes U'Milchemes Amalek. If we have to break it down, so in the Torah we have two major wars. There were some other wars too, but the major wars in the conquest of the Holy Land, so there was the war of Amalek that happened on their way, and there was the war of when they entered the land of Canaan, they had to actually capture it. As we know, the first the first Rashi, first verse in the Torah. And Rashi tells us why the first verse in the Torah is that God created heaven and earth. You may know that already. Is because God gave, the creator of the earth, gave the parts on earth that he wanted to whom he wanted to. And that's why the Torah starts with the fact that God created heaven and earth. And therefore, the people that lived in Israel at the time of the settling through Joshua were offered to stay and work along the way, be part of this, or to leave. But instead, they chose to fight, and then they met whatever they met. So very few of them decided to join, although some did. We're talking about over 3,000 years ago. Not everything. Sometimes we say nothing changed. Okay, so the Amalaek in Zayin home is he could lichbesh behem esaretz. So the war with those 7 nations was to take the land, to capture the land from them. Aval hamalchama im Amalek he beifin shel timche shekavanosi ibud Amalek. But when did they fight with Amalek? When they were on the way. They weren't taking any land from Amalek. They were just on their way to the land of Canaan, out of Egypt. Nevertheless, with the land of with the people in the land of Canaan, the mitzvah wasn't to destroy them completely. There was the regular laws that the Torah has for war. It's not the Geneva Convention; it's the Torah Convention. And that is, they could surrender and they could join and they could become part. They could join the Jewish people, etc. Whereas the war with Amalek, there was no such thing. They had to be destroyed. And that's something which is very, which begs for explanation. Why does this particular people have to be destroyed, and everyone else could become part and join? So, a total obliteration. That means the destruction of Amalek. And what does this mean then in our lives? And what we're going to have to look into is that there are certain things in our lives that we have to wage war with it, but if it will be helpful and become part of doing the right thing, it can join. Then there's other things that there has to be total obliteration, abstinence, something which can't be involved. And we'll talk about it. So what is the war with the 7 nations? What is that in serving God in our day-to-day life? The keshem shekibush eretz zayin umis in yone bepashtus, hu shekevshim es haaretz hashayeches lezayin umis, v'oisim imena eretz Yisrael. Just like the capturing of the land of the 7 nations means that we take over this land which was owned by them and transform it into the land of Israel. Eretz Yisrael. Al derech ze ba'oris Adam zeu inin kivush zayin hamidis shemehem nishtal shelu zayin ha'umois. When we serve God, we also have to capture the 7 nations. That is the 7 faculties of our soul, but of the animal soul, of the soul which is also of the evil inclination. And the 7 faculties, the attributes by which we work, by which we tick, right? The kindness, severity, the combination of them, the perseverance, etc. These 7 faculties that we have to be transformed into godly faculties, into something to serve God. So there are the 7 holy faculties, and then there are the 7 that are to be made holy, to be transformed. And the 7 nations that were there at that time, they come from the 7 unholy The seven from from what God created. He had to create the good, and then he had to create the evil, and the temptation to evil, etc. Hainu kivush hamidus de l'um hazev afichosam l'kedusha. The whole idea is to capture the faculties that are opposing being godly and transforming them to holy faculties. And this includes also to transform the intellect that actually is the seat, is the intellect, which is actually what controls these faculties. Because, like the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, that the emotions and the faculties can always be controlled and tempered by the intellect. By the wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, there are those three ideas. And by the nations, in other words, by the evil inclination within ourselves, the main thing is the emotions and the faculties, and the intellect is just so that they run as they should. So when it's not necessarily holy, then the only thing that the intellectual faculty is there for is to make sure that the attributes and the emotions and the faculties are running the way they should, but they're not a means in and of themselves. Like the slyness of the fox, which is the smartest of the, was considered the cleverest of the animals. So it's considered to be clever. In other words, why does he have to be clever? In order to do all his things, but it's only just to fulfill his being a fox, right? Remember, you can't leave the fox to watch the hen house. So, and the fox is smart enough to apply for the job, by the way. And that's you don't say that the intellect is going to rule over the emotions, because it's just part of animating and ambulating the emotions. So it's more of being part of the emotions than its own standalone faculties, so to speak. Yisrael, it says we have to pursue the knowledge of the God of your fathers, like it says in the scriptures, in Chronicles, and of course after it says that you pursue the knowledge of the God of your father, it says, and then you have to serve Him with all your heart. So then the faculty is also part of the service, not just tempering how we act, but actually to use it and to know and pursue God. And therefore we're able to actually perceive, know, and totally recognize godliness in a different way. And then therefore there are people that in the world that recognize this within us, and they're considered amongst those, most of them, they choose to be those that love us. They're those that recognize it, and therefore they choose to not love us, etc. So therefore we not only are able to know God in this way, but we're also able to temper the emotions which are of the heart. This is the idea of capturing, conquering the 7 peoples, 7 nations. What does that mean? To change it from being the land of Canaan to the good and broad land the land of Yisrael, of Israel. What does this mean? So the Rebbe expounds on this and says, "V'hinei hakibush deretz zayin ha'umes zayin hamidis v'avedis ha'adam hu'aved kosher b'yoser." Let's call a spade a spade. This conquering of the 7 nations, the 7 faculties, in our own hearts, in our own souls, these our little demons and our little whatever the little influences, and within ourselves the urges. It's tough work. To conquer that is very tough. And not only is it tough, the Rebbe says it's very, very tough. Avoida kosher b'yoser. This is very hard. But here now the Rebbe is going to say, but we have the strength. This is where we glean strength from. Here it's coming. The Torah says there are certain things that give us a clue and a clue us in to how to do this by teaching us how were the wars. How were the wars with Amalek? How were the wars with the 7 nations? Certain things we're able to work with. Certain things we have to just totally get rid of, meaning not deal with at all. So, just like physically, to conquer the 7 nations was through a big war, a large war. That's how it is spiritually. You got to work. If it's very hard to do this, then you got to work hard, and hard work is okay. No one said it's going to be easy. On the contrary, the Rebbe says here that it's actually hard. It's hard work. So someone says it's so hard. Yes, it's hard, but you have the strength and power to do it. And then look, there was a plan that maybe if we would have merited, we wouldn't have had this hard work. We would have had a different method. Moshe Rabbeinu was trying to move along a different plan. I don't know if it was plan A, B, C, or D, whatever plan it was. But it's not the plan that was ultimately adopted. And if we would have merited, then this whole conquering could have been done through Moshe Rabbeinu himself. And we spoke last week about the fact that, in the previous Maimer before this, that Rebbe speaks about how we all have a piece of Moshe in us. So now I believe that Rebbe is building on that idea too, that we have a little piece of that. But we still have the hard work because we have a big piece of us, in addition to the little piece of Moshe. So, Harehoy is a Gimel depending on what Rashi explains at the beginning of Deuteronomy, when Moshe Rabbeinu tells over the story of what happened through, there was 11 days, would have been from Egypt into Eretz Yisrael, because they had an 11-day trip, right? It says Achados Yom Yechorev, and then there's a discussion about the different, he names places, but those aren't places, those stations are just things that happened. Things that we weren't successful in doing what we were supposed to do. And Moshe alludes to the challenges that he had through our challenges and not doing what we were supposed to. But the bottom line is, we ended up being in the desert for 40 years. And we had to have this war. And then we had to come in and fight some tough wars. But it would have been the way Moshe Rabbeinu wanted in the first plan. We would have marched straight into the Holy Land within 3 days or within 11 days from leaving Egypt. And how would that have worked? Well, if you remember, towards when they were just about ready to go into Israel, they actually did have 2 miraculous wars. And that was when they conquered the land of Sichon and Og, the 2 giants. Like we read in the end of the book of Numbers, and we repeat it later. Shehem hoyu hamaginim deshitzer shel eretz zayin umes, and they were like the protectors of the land of the 7 nations. Because in other words, they were on the outskirts of Israel, and they were conquered very easily, very miraculously. It was a very miraculous outcome, where there were actually no victims on the side of the soldiers and the people of Kalal Yisrael, and just the obliteration of those 2 kings. As a matter of fact, it says so also. The prayer is that they would have that, it would be that miraculous in the subsequent wars, which the subsequent wars were much tougher. So, the victory over Sichon and Oig was above nature, was totally miraculous. So, in the plan A, then the whole taking over and conquering of Eretz Yisrael should have been like it was with Sichon and Oig. Sichon and Oig weren't even in Israel. So most certainly when in the land, it should have been this easy. And when we get into the good land and the broad land of Eretz Yisrael, so then our spiritual wars were also then, in a certain sense, also easier, also miraculous. As a matter of fact, the people then were, that Moshe Rabbeinu wanted everyone to be able to just perceive and see godliness like he did. Now, he brought us up a level, and as a matter of fact, those people called the Dordeya, they were people, they did have the greatest revelation of godliness. And nevertheless, they had challenges. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't turn into people that were totally godly, and they had their challenges on their level. Moshe Rabbeinu says this explicitly. Moshe Rabbeinu says in the portion of Aschanan, you started to show your servant, and Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to share this with all of us. We should be able to see the greatness of God, etc. He wanted to accomplish that our perception of God should be like you see something. Just like you look, you see it. You get it right away. It comes in. Not even by osmosis, just seeing it. And just like when you see something, you immediately are able to grasp that it's there. Either you enjoy it, you don't like it, but whatever it is, it's part of you. That's why it says if somebody saw something, they can't rule if there has to be a judgment about it. That's why anytime there's a judgment, you have to have something called a hearing. You have to hear about it from someone else, because then you could think about it, have it described, and how it's perceived. As a matter of fact, people don't always see everything exactly how it happened, believe it or not, etc., which this is not the place. The Rebbe talks about that at length elsewhere. But Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to give us godliness in that sense, in the ear. We should be able to just see it. And when it's something that you see, it's there, it's with you right now. So if you're looking at a book, you're looking at a table, the table is there. It's nothing, it's there, it doesn't have to be discussed. So, nevertheless, that's not what happened. But if it would have, we wouldn't have to go then, we wouldn't have to have any battles. In other words, now we have to think about the fact that, look, God created us, and He created the world, and He made a world with challenges, and He gave us a Torah, and He gave us mitzvahs, He gave us commandments, and He gave us 365 things that we shouldn't do in this world, 248 positive commandments that we should do, and we have to convince ourselves, and we have to work with our evil inclination shouldn't overcome what we're going to do, etc., etc. That's the war. And therefore we have to be, like it says, when Moshe Rabbeinu speaks about the rules of war, it says, when you go out to war, Lecha, over your enemy. You have to be over. If you're over the enemy, you're able to beat the enemy. You don't have to get involved with it. But El Yisrael, the Rebbe says that Moshe Rabbeinu really wanted something even more. Shehim, the Teilim, the Gamli, a love, in other words, Moshe Rabbeinu wanted that this war, you shouldn't even have to have enemies that you go out and wage war over them. They should just be totally submissive to you. And they should just come and say, it's much more than surrender. They should say we want to join, we want to be part of it. But this is indeed not what happened, at least yet at that point. And what happened historically? Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, did not go into the land of Israel. Ultimately, he stayed with Yidden and Golus in exile. And Yehoshua took the Jewish people into the Holy Land. So in a certain sense, they still had the aura of Moshe Rabbeinu, and they had the teachings of Moshe Rabbeinu, and they all had seen Moshe Rabbeinu, and they all had the lessons from him, etc., the leadership of Moshe Rabbeinu. But at that point, they were on their own, so to speak. Well, they had the leadership of Yeshua. Yeshua was also the top disciple of Moshe Rabbeinu. But they were now on their own because Moshe Rabbeinu was not with them. And then Ba'ata Yisrael Shema, like we spoke about last week, Moshe Rabbeinu says, hey, what does God, it's not so hard, it's not so tough. All God wants is a little bit of fear of heaven. And then, the Alter Rebbe explains, that for Moshe Rabbeinu it wasn't hard, and he shared with us this peace, this strength, that we also have a little bit of Moshe Rabbeinu in us. So he gave us a little bit, not only encouragement, but he gave us the wherewithal, so that we should also be able to have a part within us that is totally devoted. Now, it's harder to uncover that strength, and like it says in Tanya, when we have the toughest and the hardest challenges, that comes out, and that gives us we could tap into that energy. For instance, nobody would, if somebody comes over and says, hey, I want you to serve an idol, or whatever it is, you say, no, I don't do that. Even if it's someone who, was lax on some other things. Like maybe they would tie up a donkey and an ox onto one cart. Maybe their child, but at least that one they wouldn't do. Okay. Even though they were not anymore with Moshe, they were on, they had Yehoshua. Nevertheless, their first war was totally miraculous. When they captured Jericho, which was considered the doorway to the lock, so to speak, of Eretz Yisrael, it was totally miraculous. Like we all know the story, they circled the city of Jericho 7 times while they were holding the ark with the with the tablets of the Ten Commandments, and then afterwards, and they blew the shofar, etc., like the story is recorded in Joshua. Then the walls of Jericho just fell down with a miracle, totally miraculous. No drones needed. But that was also because they were still under the strength that Moshe gave them. But because it wasn't plan A or B or whatever, they didn't merit. They needed to have the subsequent battles and wars in a tough way, like Yehoshua led them actually, because that was the way to turn the world into a holy place by refining the peoples, whichever ones had to be, which waged war, or if they left, or they joined. Where does this come out then in the way we serve God day to day? So anyone can be convinced that we have to be godly people, and that there is a God in this world, there is a creator, and there's a purpose. Because nothing creates itself. Nothing happens on its own. And this is the great mystery. And the more we learn about it, the more we learn about God, and God created the world, and He created the world with a purpose. And therefore, this can be shared with anyone, that there's a God, and God did this. We don't see God? Okay, start to look, start to see. How do you look? Okay, you study Torah. God hid Himself in the Torah. God hid Himself in Torah mitzvahs, etc., etc. But everyone is possible, it's possible that everyone should be involved, every single person in the world. We'll move on, and so he's going to talk about this then and how it works with nations of the world, and therefore our own little nations in ourselves. We'll move on. Shemamtzi some kavana matara. So the Creator creates with a purpose and a goal. And indeed, we said that every person is created to serve the Creator, the Master. He's born in a zoo, and through contemplating and focusing and being aware and cognizant of this idea, then you can refine the 7 faculties within oneself. All mankind were commanded with 7 universal laws called the laws of the children of Noah. Everyone is a descendant of Noah. Those 7 laws correspond to those original 7 nations. For that matter, I believe elsewhere it says they also correspond to the 70 nations, and everyone is a member of that. Everyone could fulfill those 7 laws, of course. Belief in God, and not to curse, no blasphemy of God, not to kill, not to steal, not to be immoral sexually, and not to be adulterous, in other words. And not to steal also means lying and cheating and things like that. And not to eat a limb off of a living animal. That includes to be humane, and to have a justice system, a system of law and order. So everyone could keep those 7 laws. So when we work with ourselves, we all have to focus on the fact that there's a God. And through this cognizance and awareness and contemplating about this idea, so when you think about this, so then you're able to transform the 7 faculties that are trying to convince us to do and feel otherwise into holiness. The first thing is that we have to subdue our 7 faculties that are tough. But before we can transform them, they have to be subdued. So subduing it is called iskafia. Kfiya bilvat, to force it to not to indulge, etc. Then from the easier to the tougher, to transform it into something which is totally focused and devoted to God and godliness. They could also be transformed into holiness. So through refining these 7 faculties, after we've done that, then we can come to refining the intellectual capability. So if remember, we said earlier that there's the way the intellect is directly connected to how the emotions work, and especially in the part of us that's not like, that's the evil inclination, and that's telling us to not do what we're supposed to do. So there, the moichin, the intellect, is considered part of it, because it's just there to animate and to convince us and to tell us to be part of that. But when we go to the holy side, so to speak, then the intellect is something in and of itself. The intellect is in and of itself a form of service, and the top perception of God is intellectual. And the ultimate of that is going to be when Mashiach comes, when there won't only be the capture of the 7 nations, but then it will be the capture of what's called the 10 nations, the additional 3 peoples called Keni, Knizi, and Kadmoini. So that'll be the idea of the way we'll perceive godliness in a way that we can't right now. So Vaydesh Lemus Avodah Bebir Zayin Amidis Bei Machkach Lebir Hamoichin Shezeh Yelo Asid Lavoi Kishatia Gam Eretz Keni Knizi V'Kadmoini Eretz Eser Amamin Unkonvur B'Divar Maschal Totzer LaAdmor Amtzoi, like the middle Rebbe, the second Rebbe, explains. she'oz lo yihi ha'inyan dal totzes me'av mishum she'oz yihi gam birin ha'moichin mamash. So, it says we're commanded not to leave alone and not to subject the nation of Moav to the rest and to leave them alone. That's Ammon and Moav. They are cousins, etc. And they're not allowed to convert. The males couldn't, the females could. That's why, of course, King David was a descendant of Ruth, who was from Moav, etc. But in a deeper sense, we can't do that because that corresponds to the lands that represent the intellect. And that won't happen until Mashiach comes. But when Mashiach does come, then we will have those lands and we'll have that idea of the intellect being totally transformed. Like the Tanya explains, till that time, we refine the 7 faculties, the emotions. Like actually the halacha is that the Eretz Yisrael is only the land of the 7 nations. The other parts are not considered Eretz Yisrael, except when Mashiach will come. Then it actually says that Eretz Yisrael will spread forth into the whole world. But that's a whole another story. So now we're going to go back to what we started with. The mere fact that the peoples then, and then for that matter, our little, who are represented then by those 7 peoples that have to be conquered, which represents also our 7 faculties that also have to be conquered. Why aren't they godly? Why? In other words, what does this represent? How did God create it? How did God make it? There is the first top nation who instructs and tells all the other nations, don't be part, be oppositional. That's Amalek. The nations on their own, if they didn't have this influence of Amalek, they would, if they would just be on their own, they would be part, they would agree. They would be agreeable. Like the Medrash says, if the nations would have known how great the Holy Temple in Jerusalem was for them, and how much it accomplished for them in their own lives, they wouldn't have destroyed it. It says over there. Here it doesn't say, the Rebbe doesn't mention that at this spot. But it says they would actually have brought legions and battalions to protect it. Why would they have done that? Because they could recognize this idea that the world is created by God with a purpose. The ein dover esetz atzmai, right? This idea that we have to think about the fact that nothing creates itself. So there is a creator, there is a purpose, and we're part of it. The mere fact that God created everybody, including the nations of the world, everybody, is for a reason and to be part of the godly plan. And they would know then that on every sukkah, the 70 bulls that were offered corresponded to the 70 nations. An offering was brought. That illustrates the connection that everybody has to God's plan and to God and godliness, and therefore they're represented in the offerings. Albeit, like the Rebbe says, even though the first day of Sukkot 13 bulls are brought, and the second day 12, and it goes down 11, 10, 9, 8 till 7. So that represents the idea of the diminishing of influence that is not proper, that should be decreased in that sense, and not and it should be the striving for God and godliness and the true purpose of creation. And the fact that they're not cognizant of this idea, that's not what's on the front burner and first and foremost in their mind. that there's a creator, there's the right thing to do. But on the contrary, we focus on the other stuff. That's because Amalek came in and said, it's not so important. If you look historically, what happened? It says, one of the things is they cooled you off. And the Rebbe doesn't say it here, but it says elsewhere that Amalek, the numerical value of the name Amalek is suffix, the same like a doubt. They just said, look, the people had just come out of Egypt. The whole nation, Egypt, there was 10 plagues. They chased them out. The Jews were brought through the Split Sea on dry land. The Egyptians drowned. You know how awesome that is? Everyone was scared. It says everybody was scared. And Amalek came along, and they just said, no biggie. Let's fight with them anyway. This was a total, that's why they illustrated a total disregard for blatant godliness. They were just demonstrating that they couldn't care less. Even though God was with these people, we can still be oppositional to God and godliness. And this is what they did in practice. They came and they attacked. And God then gives us this mitzvah. So let's talk about how the Rebbe brings it. Where does this blatant audacity come from? What is it about? So the even Pharaoh had this idea that he was trying to pass himself off also as a deity, and like it says in Ezekiel, that the Pharaoh said, "Unto me is the river, and I made it," but it says, "I made myself." He actually did say he created himself, and he was a whole deity, right? That's why God used to tell Moses, go meet him in the river in the morning. That's when he was going to relieve himself away from anyone so no one should see. Like this the whole day he was trying to demonstrate himself as a deity. Nevertheless, the Rebbe says, "Hudavar bilti ragil klal." This is not a usual thing. This is even such a klippa, such an evil, such open, brash, unbrashed, shall we say, arrogance is also not the norm. So Pharaoh is also a special case, and Amalek was like that. Bilam himself, who was in tune with God, so to speak, but nevertheless, he was from the other side, from the klippah, from the, so to speak, opposition. Even he said, before he said that the first and foremost of nations is Amalek, he said, I won't be able to transgress or to do different than what the mouth of God says to me. Like the Alter Rebbe explained in Tanya that there are certain things that God makes sure that they wouldn't be able to transgress God's holy will. May be blessed. So what happened? El Shabbat Amalek umatl bem sveikis. But Amalek came along and put a doubt into all this. He said, maybe it's not so big. What does the Medrash say earlier about, were it to be that if the nations would know, it means that they were in doubt. They didn't know. There was a doubt there. They couldn't recognize. They didn't see it. Why? Because Amalek put this in. V'gam kiridos, this coldness, this